Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. Yesterday was absolutely packed. We reviewed 30 stories and picked the 5 that really captured the zeitgeist of what's happening in tech right now. And wow, what a mix we've got for you today. We're going from the incredible dedication of one person mapping thousands of European metro stations to the absurdly minimalist world of 2 pixel fonts, then diving into some serious privacy concerns with encryption under attack in Europe, a massive leak from China's Great Firewall, and finally, a thought-provoking study about how our mental habits might affect our aging brains. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. The practical value here is huge too. Multiple commenters pointed out how these detailed models are game changers for accessibility. If you're navigating with reduced mobility, or even just trying to figure out the fastest route through an unfamiliar station, having these accurate 3D representations is invaluable. One user mentioned how they finally understood why certain transfer corridors in their local station seemed unnecessarily long. Turns out they're routing around foundation pillars from buildings above. Now, there's this interesting standardization pattern that emerges when you look across different cities. Most follow this template: mezzanine at level -1, platforms at -2. But then each city adds its own twist based on local constraints. Alicante, for example, directly connects their metro stations to underground parking lots that sit above the tunnel system. It's like urban Tetris, fitting all these pieces together in 3 dimensions. The technical achievement here shouldn't be understated either. During the discussion, people were sharing how Albert apparently ramped up his work during COVID lockdown, digitizing hundreds of hand-drawn stations. And this isn't just copying blueprints. Many of these stations don't have publicly available architectural plans. He's been visiting them, measuring, observing, and reconstructing these spaces from scratch. Of course, not everyone's impressed. There's always that one commenter, right? Someone pointed out the site's been around since 2012, doesn't use HTTPS, and has been posted to Hacker News 7 times before. They seemed to think it wasn't newsworthy. But honestly, that misses the point entirely. This is the kind of project that deserves to resurface periodically because new people discover it, and frankly, it keeps growing. The platform now covers cities that weren't even included in earlier versions. The community also started sharing related resources, which turned into this beautiful rabbit hole of transit visualization projects. Someone linked to a similar project for New York subway. Another shared detailed PDFs of London Underground station layouts. It's like this one project sparked a whole appreciation thread for transit documentation. There were some technical critiques about the platform itself. Apparently, the map zooming is pretty sluggish, and someone suggested that Leaflet might not be the best choice for this kind of visualization. But you know what? When you've single-handedly documented half the metro stations in Europe, I think we can forgive some performance issues. What really strikes me about this whole thing is how it represents the best of what individual creators can accomplish on the internet. No funding, no team, just one person with a passion for transit infrastructure who decided to document something that nobody else was documenting at this scale. And now, thousands of people, from tourists to urban planners to accessibility advocates, have this incredible resource at their fingertips. That's the kind of internet project that makes you optimistic about what individuals can still create and share with the world. Speaking of pushing boundaries and individual creativity, let's go from mapping the vast underground networks of Europe to something at the complete opposite end of the scale spectrum. 2Slice, a font that's only 2 pixels tall. Yes, you heard that right. 2 pixels tall. And somehow, against all logic and reason, it's actually readable. This is one of those projects that perfectly captures the spirit of "because I can" engineering that I absolutely love. A developer has created what might be the world's smallest functional font, pushing typography to its absolute physical limits. We're talking about representing entire letters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, punctuation, in a space that's literally 2 pixels high. That's barely anything. On most modern screens, that's smaller than a grain of sand. What's fascinating is the claim that this font actually becomes easier to read at smaller sizes. Now, that sounds completely backwards, right? Everything we know about typography says smaller equals harder to read. But apparently there's something about how our brains process these minimal pixel patterns that works better when they're tiny. The creator even describes it with this wonderfully paradoxical tagline, "You can probably read this, even if you wish you couldn't." There's something delightfully masochistic about that. The Hacker News discussion around this, and wow, it got over 500 points and more than 100 comments, turned into this beautiful nostalgia trip about the early days of computing. People were sharing stories about the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and other 8-bit systems where squeezing readable text into impossibly small spaces wasn't just a fun experiment, it was a necessity. You had these machines with tiny amounts of memory and low-resolution displays, and developers had to get creative. One commenter mentioned how they used to fit entire programs into screens that would make modern developers weep. But here's where it gets interesting. There's actually a technical debate about whether this font is truly 2 pixels tall. Several users pointed out that you need spacing between the letters to make them readable. So while each character might be 2 pixels high, the effective size with padding is more like 4 by 4 pixels. It's like, is a house just the walls, or does it include the yard? The purists are arguing it's cheating, while others say the achievement stands regardless. And then there's the readability question. Most people seem impressed that they can actually make out the text, but it really depends on context. English language patterns help a lot here. Your brain fills in the gaps based on what words should be there. One user with nerve problems in their eyes said they couldn't read it at all, which is a good reminder that accessibility matters even in experimental projects like this. What I find particularly clever is that the developer included both uppercase and lowercase variants. At 2 pixels tall, you'd think there wouldn't be room for variation, but apparently they found a way to make letters distinguishable in both cases. That's some serious pixel wizardry. The font is released under Creative Commons, so anyone can use it for personal or commercial projects with attribution. Though I'm trying to imagine the commercial use case here. Maybe for the world's most annoying terms and conditions, or perhaps some kind of art project about the limits of communication. Actually, you know what? I could see this being useful for certain data visualization scenarios where you need to label thousands of tiny elements. This whole project reminds me why I love the tech community. Someone spent who knows how many hours perfecting a font that's almost impossibly small, not because there was a pressing need for it, but because it was an interesting challenge. It's pushing boundaries just to see where they are. And then hundreds of people gathered to discuss, debate, and reminisce about it. That's the kind of wonderfully pointless, yet somehow meaningful innovation that keeps technology fun. But, while some developers are using their skills to create delightfully tiny fonts, others are dealing with much more serious questions about privacy and encryption. And speaking of things that are hard to read, let's talk about politicians trying to understand cryptography. All right, so shifting gears here, we need to talk about ChatControl and how Denmark is essentially saying privacy schmivacy right now. This story about the ChatControl update has absolutely exploded on Hacker News, with nearly 500 points and 300 comments. And honestly, I can see why people are fired up. So here's what's happening. The EU has been pushing this ChatControl proposal that would basically require tech companies to scan all our messages, even the encrypted ones, supposedly to protect children from abuse material. And look, nobody's against protecting kids, but the tech community is basically having a collective aneurysm over this because, well, you can't have your encryption cake and eat it too. You either have secure communications or you don't. What's particularly wild about this update is that even though there's a blocking minority preventing this from moving forward at the EU level, Denmark has decided to just go ahead anyway. Their Justice Minister, Peter Hummelgaard, actually said, and I'm not making this up, that encrypted communication isn't a civil liberty. Like, excuse me, in 2024, when our entire lives run through digital channels, you're telling me secure communication isn't a fundamental right? The Hacker News crowd is absolutely roasting this, and they're making some really solid points. First off, there's the technical impossibility of what they're asking for. It's like demanding a lock that only good guys can open. That's not how cryptography works. Once you create a backdoor, it's there for everyone. Hackers, foreign governments, whoever finds it first. One commenter pointed out that this would actually make kids less safe online because their data would be more vulnerable to predators who exploit these security holes. And here's where it gets really interesting. There's this whole conspiracy theory floating around, though maybe it's not so conspiratorial, that companies like Palantir are pushing hard for this legislation because they stand to make billions from the surveillance infrastructure. Multiple commenters are connecting the dots between lobbying efforts and which politicians are suddenly very concerned about encrypted messaging. The community is also pointing out the absurd workarounds this will create. Like, okay, so you ban encrypted messaging apps? What's stopping me from just encrypting my text locally and sending it as a file attachment? Or using a VPN to route through a country that actually respects privacy? Several people mentioned they'd just switch to VPNs, which, plot twist, might be controlled by foreign intelligence services. So, congratulations, you've just pushed your citizens' communications into the hands of potentially hostile nations. Now, there was one contrarian voice in the discussion that I think deserves attention. This user, TestDelac1, made the law enforcement argument. They basically said, look, watch the wire. When criminals have perfect operational security through encryption, they become untouchable. They brought up these UK car theft rings that coordinate entirely through encrypted channels and are basically running circles around police. And, I mean, there's something to that argument, right? We do pay a societal cost when bad actors have tools that make them invisible. But here's the thing, and this is what the majority of commenters kept coming back to. We tried the no encryption thing already. It was called the entire history of human communication before the 1990s, and guess what? Crime still existed. Criminals just used code words, dead drops, and face-to-face meetings. The idea that breaking encryption will suddenly make crime solvable it's magical thinking. What really gets me about this whole situation is the sheer persistence of it. The community noted that this is like the third or fourth attempt to push essentially the same legislation through. It's like that friend who keeps asking to borrow money even though you've said no 5 times already. At what point do we just accept that secure communication is here to stay? The Danish move is particularly concerning because it might create this patchwork of surveillance states within the EU. Imagine trying to run a tech company where you need different versions of your app for different countries based on their encryption paranoia levels. It's a nightmare scenario for innovation. And you know what nobody seems to be talking about in the political sphere? The fact that the bad actors they're trying to catch, they're not going to use compliant messaging apps anyway. They'll move to obscure platforms, use steganography, or just develop their own tools. Meanwhile, regular citizens, journalists, activists, and yes, abuse victims who need secure communication to escape their abusers, they're the ones who get hurt. The whole thing feels like politicians who don't understand technology trying to legislate mathematics. And, spoiler alert, math doesn't care about your laws. You can't legislate pi to equal 3, and you can't legislate encryption to be selectively breakable. That's just not how the universe works. And speaking of surveillance and censorship, if you think Denmark's approach is concerning, wait until you hear about what just leaked from China's Great Firewall. Geedge and MESA leak. All right, so our next story is absolutely massive. We're talking about what appears to be the largest document leak from China's Great Firewall ever. Geedge and MESA leak, analyzing the Great Firewall's largest document leak. And folks, when I say massive, I mean over 600 gigabytes of internal documents, source code, and communications that just got exposed to the world. This happened back on September 11th, 2025, and it's kind of mind-blowing what we're seeing here. The leak comes from two major players in China's internet censorship apparatus, Geedge Networks, which is run by Fang Bingsing, who's literally known as the father of the Great Firewall, and the MESA lab at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. We're talking about 500 gigs just in RPM packaging server archives alone. Now, what makes this particularly fascinating and honestly pretty concerning is that these documents don't just show how China censors its own internet, they reveal something much bigger. China has been exporting this surveillance technology to other countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. We're seeing evidence of this tech going to Myanmar, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Kazakhstan, essentially packaging digital authoritarianism as a service that other governments can deploy. The Hacker News community is having a field day with this one. 408 points, 123 comments, and the discussion is really rich. You've got people sharing their experiences bypassing the Great Firewall, talking about technical methods like protocol obfuscation and V2Ray, basically ways to disguise your traffic as legitimate HTTP requests so it doesn't get flagged. It's this constant cat-and-mouse game between censors and people trying to access the open internet. What really struck me in the documents is the domestic operations piece. They're providing censorship services to provincial governments in Xinjiang, Jiangsu, and Fujian. And Xinjiang, that's particularly troubling given everything we know about surveillance of the Uyghur population there. This isn't just about blocking websites anymore, it's about comprehensive digital surveillance infrastructure. The community discussion also got into this really interesting ethical debate about the developers who build these tools. Like, at what point do you say, I'm not going to write code that helps authoritarian governments spy on their citizens? Some folks in the thread were pretty harsh about it, questioning the moral responsibility of engineers who work on these systems. Though you did have one commenter who just dismissed the whole thing, saying society is already doomed, which, that's one way to look at it, but it feels like giving up on a pretty important fight for internet freedom.
What's wild is thinking about the implications here. If China can successfully export this technology under the guise of helping developing nations build their digital infrastructure, we could see the splinternet become even more fragmented. Countries that adopt these systems aren't just getting firewalls, they're getting comprehensive surveillance packages that can monitor, censor, and control information flow at a population level. The technical details in the leak are apparently pretty extensive too. People in the comments were discussing how the system works, how it identifies and blocks VPN traffic, how it does deep packet inspection. It's sophisticated stuff. And the fact that this all leaked, that's gotta be a huge embarrassment for the Chinese government, especially for someone like Fang Bingsing, who's built his entire career on this technology. I think what we're seeing here is a pivotal moment in the global fight for internet freedom. This leak gives us unprecedented visibility into not just how the Great Firewall works, but how China is actively working to export digital authoritarianism globally. And with 600 gigs of data to sift through, I have a feeling we're going to be learning a lot more about this system in the coming weeks and months. After all this talk about surveillance, censorship, and control, let's shift to something a bit more introspective. Literally. Our last story today is about what happens inside our own heads and how our thought patterns might be shaping our cognitive future. All right, so here's something that might make you think twice about your inner monologue. Our next story is repetitive negative thinking associated with cognitive decline in older adults. And wow, this one really struck a nerve on Hacker News with 365 points and a pretty heated discussion. So, researchers looked at 424 older adults, all over 60, and they found this fascinating but kind of concerning connection between what they call perseverative thinking, which, that's a mouthful, but essentially they measured how much people tend to dwell on negative thoughts, and they found this dose-response relationship. The more you ruminate, the worse your cognitive scores. People in the highest quartile for negative thinking showed significantly lower cognitive performance compared to those who don't get stuck in those loops as much.
Now, what really caught my attention is how they're positioning this as a transdiagnostic mechanism. That's fancy speak for saying this could be the missing link that explains why depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions all seem to increase dementia risk. It's like, imagine if all these different mental health roads lead to the same cognitive decline destination, and repetitive negative thinking is the vehicle taking you there. But here's where the Hacker News community really went to town on this study, and honestly, they raised some excellent points. The biggest pushback? The whole chicken and egg problem. Are people experiencing cognitive decline because they're thinking negatively, or are they thinking negatively because their brain is already struggling? One commenter made this brilliant observation. Imagine you're starting to notice you can't remember things as well. You're making more mistakes. Wouldn't that naturally lead to more worry and negative thinking? There was this one comment that really stood out to me from someone named BB Barnett, who basically said, look, maybe older people are negative because they've watched younger generations make the same mistakes over and over while completely ignoring their advice. And you know what? That's actually a pretty solid point. Maybe what we're calling repetitive negative thinking is sometimes just pattern recognition mixed with frustration. The methodological criticisms were pretty brutal too. Several users pointed out that this is essentially one questionnaire being used as a proxy for another questionnaire, and when you put it that way, it does sound a bit like measuring shadows to predict the weather, doesn't it? Plus, there's no actual neuroscientific evidence here. No brain scans, no biomarkers, just self-reported feelings and cognitive test scores. But let me play devil's advocate for a second. Even if the causation isn't clear, the correlation is still interesting, especially from a tech perspective. The researchers are suggesting that repetitive negative thinking could be a modifiable risk factor. Translation, maybe we can do something about it. And that's where my brain immediately goes to the potential for digital interventions. Could we develop AI-powered cognitive behavioral therapy apps that specifically detect and interrupt these negative thought patterns? Imagine your smartwatch noticing you're stuck in a rumination loop and gently nudging you toward a mindfulness exercise.
Though honestly, part of me wonders if that's solving the wrong problem. One commenter made this evolutionary argument that really resonated. Our brains are wired for negative thinking because historically the cost of missing a threat was way higher than the cost of false alarms. The person who worried about that rustling in the bushes survived, even if it was usually just wind. So maybe what we're calling pathological is actually deeply human. The study does have this hopeful angle, though. If negative thinking patterns really are modifiable, and that's a big if, it suggests we might have more control over our cognitive future than we thought. Not through some magic pill, but through changing how we engage with our own thoughts. Though I've got to say, telling someone to just think positive to prevent cognitive decline feels about as helpful as telling someone with insomnia to just sleep better. What really gets me is this fundamental question the discussion raised. Are we medicalizing normal human responses to aging and mortality? As one commenter pointed out, when you're facing legitimate challenges, health issues, loss of independence, friends passing away, is it really repetitive negative thinking or just processing reality? The whole thing reminds me why I love the Hacker News community. They'll take a study that sounds pretty definitive on the surface and absolutely dissect it, not out of cynicism, but out of genuine intellectual curiosity. And in this case, their skepticism seems pretty warranted. We've got a cross-sectional study trying to imply causation, questionnaires being used as proxies for complex neurological processes, and a rebranding of rumination as RNT that one user hilariously called out as basically a marketing term. And that wraps up our deep dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a journey, right? We went from the underground labyrinths of European metros to fonts so small they challenged the very concept of readability. We explored the ongoing battle for digital privacy in Europe, witnessed the largest leak from China's censorship apparatus, and questioned whether our own thoughts might be shaping our cognitive destiny. What strikes me about today's selection is how they all touch on boundaries and limitations in different ways. Albert Guillaume's pushed past the boundaries of what one person could document. The two-slice font pushes the physical limits of typography. Denmark's ChatControl pushes against the boundaries of privacy.
China's Great Firewall leak exposes the boundaries nations try to impose on information. And that cognitive decline study questions the boundaries between normal aging and pathology.
These were the 5 stories that rose to the top from the 30 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday. The ones that got people talking, debating, and sometimes arguing passionately. And that's what makes this community so special. The willingness to dig deeper, to question assumptions, and to share knowledge generously. Thanks for joining me for the Hacker News Daily. Keep questioning, keep building, and keep pushing those boundaries. Until next time, this is your host signing off. Stay curious, everyone.